Good afternoon, my name is Morgan. I'm a freshman econ major here at Drake, and my research focuses on the intersection of globalization and the International Court of Justice. So when I set out to conduct this research, I really was focusing on globalization in general and how it affects the ICJ. But early on in my literature review, something that I latched onto was discussion about how globalization affects the enforcement mechanisms of the ICJ. And so looking at it in this perspective is really what allowed my research to take off, and it formed the research question that I pursued in the research. So my research question was, how does globalization affect the ICJ's influence? And this was the guiding research question that I had in the back of my mind the entire time. And in order to really pick apart what influence is, I looked at not only compliance with ICJ decisions, but also how jurisdiction is handled and how jurisdiction is accepted from the ICJ. So this subcategory is really interesting because there is a vast dichotomy between what you see in law and in practice. The difference between what you're going to see on paper and in the real world is something that I encountered several times over the course of my research, and which was ultimately important for me to understand my final conclusion. Specifically, when you look at the ICJ statute and the UN Charter, these establishing documents tell a very clear story about how international law should function. They say the ICJ derives its jurisdiction from the consent of member states. And they also say that when the ICJ issues a decision, there isn't necessarily a compulsory enforcement mechanism like a police force we would have in a domestic system. However, there is a hard enforcement mechanism in the form of the Security Council. What can occur is that if, let's say you're in a aggrieved state before the ICJ, and the ICJ orders another state to pay reparations of some kind to you, and they don't. You can go to the Security Council, according to these establishing documents, and ask for the Security Council to take the action that's necessary to call upon that country to do what the ICJ told it to do. However, in practice, there are a few roadblocks that prevent this from actually occurring. Let's say that you're in that aggrieved state again, and the Security Council has already issued a resolution on the topic. Or let's say you're unfortunate enough to be Nicaragua, and the United States or another permanent member of the Security Council is the state that you're trying to seek reparations from. In that case, it's going to be actually impossible, or nearly impossible, for you to actually get the Security Council to call upon that state. They're not going to issue, the United States is going to veto any measure to call upon itself to do what it was supposed to do. And what that means is that because of this lack of a reliable enforcement mechanism, the ICJ must rely upon voluntary compliance. So theories regarding this voluntary compliance are really what the literature focuses on and what I focus on in my research. This is the theory that I sort of derived from the literature I reviewed. This theory connects globalization with voluntary compliance. Basically, to walk you through this theory, globalization can be seen at its very core as just the increase of exchanges across borders. There are exchanges in ideas, exchanges in money, exchanges in commodities at all levels, from heads of state, to political elite, to citizenry. It's all sorts of increased communications and increased interactions that come with globalization and come with transportation and communications technology. And it's this increased interaction that creates interdependence. Interdependence is something that exists in a complex matrix of international relations. Interdependence describes a situation where countries are interacting with each other to such a degree that their matters are intertwined. And something that's important to note is that you can't see interdependence if you're just looking at two countries, or even just a handful of countries. Interdependence, in order to understand it, necessitates looking at the entire international system to understand how it operates. And it's this interdependence, these interdependent relations, that create what's known as reciprocity. Reciprocity in international law is what's known as a natural deterrent. And natural deterrents are anything that can be seen as an alternative to centralized enforcement mechanisms, such as the Security Council. The other primary natural deterrent I encountered in my literature review was called law habit. And law habit describes a situation where countries will adhere to ICJ decisions on the basis of absolute pure respect on a philosophical level for international law. However, reciprocity says that countries will comply with international law not out of respect for the law and not out of respect for other countries, but instead out of pure self-interest. Reciprocity relies upon the principle of self-interest. This means that, let's say you're a state that the ICJ is called upon to take some action in another state. You have to pay reparations, you have to stay out of a certain area that has produced research or technological innovation, let's say in the sea. It could be really anything. Even if taking this action, the ICJ has called upon you, it provides a short-term harm, it's still in your long-term best interest, according to reciprocity, to actually follow the decision, because by doing so, you're increasing your credibility among your peers, and you're enhancing your ability to be protected by the ICJ in the future. So that's what reciprocity relies upon. For those of you who were here earlier today for the discussion of political theory in Egypt, this can be seen as something that fits into liberalism as opposed to realism, to make another connection. So exists reciprocity in this theory that lends itself to voluntary compliance with international law, and voluntary acceptance of the ICJ's influence, both in terms of jurisdiction and compliance. So in order to put this theory that I found to the test quantitatively, I adopted a research design that used two hypotheses. Hypothesis one relates compliance with international law to globalization. It asks if countries or instances of compliance with international law see the countries involved having a higher globalization index than those that do not. Hypothesis two is very, very similar. However, instead of compliance, we're talking about jurisdiction. So do countries that accept the ICJ's jurisdiction have a higher globalization index than those that do not? What I did for both of these tests is I created two different groups. So instances of compliance and non-compliance, and in the hypothesis two, countries that comply or that, accept ICJ jurisdiction and countries that don't. And I took the mean globalization index, compared the mean, and decided using statistics if that difference was significant. So a bit to explain my parameters a little bit more. In order to quantify globalization, I used the KOF globalization index. I favor this measure because I really like that it factors in economic, political, and social characteristics of globalization, instead of just looking at it from one angle. And it also looks at all different levels of society, from the head of government to the regular citizen. Then in terms of compliance, what I did to create my groups is I looked through the ICJ docket and reviewed every case and saw if there was an ICJ decision that was created. I followed up to see if that action had actually been taken according to the ICJ decision. And in order to determine that it had or hadn't, there needed to be clear evidence. For example, if there was just allegations or news reports that the country hadn't complied or didn't plan to comply, that wasn't enough to consider it an example of non-compliance. I needed clear evidence, which usually came in the form of an actual statement from the head of government saying, we have absolutely no intention of following this decision, or an internationally recognized inability to comply that took place over the years. Finally, with regards to jurisdiction, what I used was basically just statements of compulsory jurisdiction. So in the ICJ, being a member state of the United Nations does not make you accepting of ICJ jurisdiction automatically. Instead, each and every state has to file with the Secretary General's office with a clear statement of, we accept the ICJ's compulsory jurisdiction. And so that was a lot easier to quantify. And so I just created groups of countries that had accepted jurisdiction and countries that hadn't. So to get into my results, with jurisdiction, what you're going to see here is there is a clear difference of about 10.4 points of the globalization index between countries that accept jurisdiction and countries that do not. So clearly there's a difference, but we can actually use statistics to determine that that difference was significant. I'll direct you here to the p-value. The p-value in this case was lower than 0.000001. This is extremely low. And it would actually, to put it into layman's terms, it indicates that it is nearly impossible that this difference is due to mere random chance. However, with regards to results with compliance, there was again a difference. In instances of compliance and non-compliance, in instances of compliance, there was a higher globalization index than instances of non-compliance. However, using statistics, I determined that it wasn't necessarily significant. The p-value here was 0.445, which is too high to be considered significant. So that doesn't mean that there is no effect. That just means that we can't rule out this simply being a matter of random error, a random chance. So in looking at the results that I found, actually when I was calculating the final p-value results, I was really surprised. If I had to pick at the beginning one hypothesis I thought would be true, it would have been compliance rather than jurisdiction. But what we're seeing here is, once again, something that I talked about at the very beginning. There's a difference between law and practice. Jurisdiction is something that is very much on paper. Jurisdiction, the statements of jurisdiction have a press release that comes to everyone. You can easily look up in the ICJ docket on the ICJ website and determine whether or not a country has accepted jurisdiction. It's institutionalized, it's formalized, it's public. It can almost be seen as a symbolic display of an acceptance of ICJ influence. Whereas compliance exists in the real world. Compliance with the decision that the ICJ has issued is something that exists in a de facto sense, so it exists in the real world. So the biggest takeaway I have from this is not only the substantial results in terms of globalization mattering jurisdiction and not compliance, but rather just seeing once again that there, in international law, there's a clear difference between what happens on paper and what happens in the real world. And I hope to apply that and to use that perspective in future studies of international law. In addition, there are a few other implications I think that these results will have for other studies I would like to pursue. For example, specifically with regards to other international institutions, I would really like to see I would like to implement this research and this design in a similar fashion to the International Criminal Court, which deals with individual prosecutions, and to see if we would find similar results. I would be fascinated to find that they were similar, or they were different, or maybe there would be completely different trends that are not comparable to the ICJ at all. I'd also like to look at regional reciprocity, because my entire theory rested on the idea that reciprocity exists in the international system. It requires the entire international system. And I'm wondering if maybe if we're looking at regional trade agreements or regional agreements as to borders or certain maritime limitation, perhaps it'd be increased reciprocity. Or perhaps if we look at just within specific economic groups, OECD countries or other countries that you could look at, specific industries, perhaps there'd be increased reciprocity in that regard. Finally, I'd also like to go back to actually the findings that I have here and stratify the data to look and see if independence in an economic sense plays a role. Specifically with regards to the non-compliant countries, perhaps it's the case that countries that are highly economically independent are insulated from the pressures that reciprocity provides for other countries. So they don't see necessarily as much of a loss when they don't comply with international law. And perhaps we would see there are very different trends for countries that are economically dependent versus independent if you looked at trade balance and GDP. You can measure it with a lot of different variables. And you have to be very careful with research design, but I really think it would be very interesting. And I sincerely hope that these aren't the only ideas that are brought up by this research. I hope that the concepts that I brought up can be connected to other concepts and applied for future research.
Today. My name is Konrad, and today we're going to be talking about currency hedging in global investment portfolios. I hope you're really excited about this conversation that we're about to embark on, because I personally am very passionate about this subject. Don't judge me, it's a pretty niche market for me to be really excited about it. So, to give you a little bit of background today about the subject, we're going to go into a few of the details about why I'm so passionate about the subject. We're also going to talk about currency hedging and what it is. We're going to talk about the research that I conducted as a part of my presentation and part of my paper. And we'll also talk about why it really matters in our current environment, and then also some of the repercussions because of that research. So a little bit of background about my thesis and what we're going to talk about today. Basically, my understanding about the global investment world and why it is important to invest internationally as an investor, like a personal investor, I want to invest internationally to gain exposure to new markets and new possible returns. However, the nice thing, or the not nice thing about the returns potential also brings new risks. And as an investment manager, as your friendly neighborhood advisor will tell you, that risk and return are positively correlated. As you go up in risk, you also go up in potential return. So what I'm trying to do as an investment manager is try and mitigate my risk and maximize my return for my investors. And one of the ways we can do this is invest internationally. Yet there are some risks that we can identify specifically and eliminate as much as possible, and that is through hedging currencies. So my thesis is that for investors who do not want to be exposed to fluctuations in foreign currency markets, we want to hedge their portfolios so that way they can make the most money and lose the most, have the least exposure to risk. However, before investing in this hedging strategy, we really need to make sure that we have a good understanding of the risks that go along with that specific strategy. And I posed 3 questions in my analysis that investors need to consider. Do my investors want to be exposed to currency risk? Is that something that they're looking for? If currency hedging is desired, what are the benefits of reduced risks, and do they in fact outweigh the costs that are associated with those? So a little bit of background about myself. I'm currently a senior. I'm from Geneva, Illinois, and I'm an accounting and finance major. I'm in a CDPA, as those majors would suggest. And my interest in derivatives started when I began taking a finance course about derivatives. And I also began to work at Principal downtown a couple years ago. And then I recently transitioned over to the investment team where I work with accounting for derivatives today. So why invest in foreign markets? As I talked about earlier, there's tons of untapped potential in the foreign world, foreign markets for lenders and buyers to give and receive money. And basically, as an investor, you're able to invest money in another country and gain returns and make your net worth as high as possible. And the domestic markets are very limited, and the fact that you can invest in future markets is something that's very lucrative. And then over the past couple of years, or this past couple of decades, we can see the evolvement of this international monetary system and all these international relations that relating to specifically economics and finance and how they develop. Incredible investment and growth opportunities are throughout, whether we're looking at, let's say specifically China. The Chinese growth rate for their GDP over the past couple of decades have been insurmountably larger than the growth rate in the US. So as an investor, I am looking for the most potential returns, and if I can move my money invested in China with a GDP growth rate of some places 8%, 10% versus my 3%, 2% growth rate in the US markets, I'm going to have a much higher growth potential in the future. All right, the foreign exchange market has come into play because of this desire for people to invest internationally. And when we want to move money from country to country, we have to buy and sell foreign currencies within the foreign exchange market. And this gives the most liquid, most actively traded market in the entire world. If we think about the bonds market, we think about the equity market, buying stocks in specific companies, these pale in comparison as the foreign exchange market. On a daily basis, $5.3 trillion US dollars are traded, the equivalent of $5.3 trillion US dollars are traded internationally. And that is a significant importance to the international financial sector. As you can see, there's significant impacts of those FX rates, of basically the price of one currency relative to another. Over the past couple years, you can see there's significant movement on a daily basis or even a monthly basis that really alter economics and finance as well. There's lots of factors that affect these rates, including interest rates, how the countries set up their personal financing policy, like the Federal Reserve, the US sets a base interest rate that basically affects the interest rates that all US companies will provide. Inflation rates, if there's incredibly high inflation, it's going to have a negative effect on that currency as money will move around and ultimately rebalance the system and make everything as equal as possible. And also political factors. For example, recently the Japanese Prime Minister had a discussion with a newspaper just a couple days ago, and because of that discussion about the US and the US political system, the yen appreciated against the US dollars 2% in one day. So there's significant impacts from all around. So the mindset of an international investment manager is that we want to make sure that we're taking as many risks to get the rewards that we need, yet not exposing our clients to significant risk. So the investing in the global markets is really all about the trade-off of risk and return. And as you can see from the graph over to the right, what this does is it takes one international index and relates it back into its own foreign currency, and it shows the impact of the foreign currency. So it is a little bit small on the right, but in 2013, the MSCI World Price Index gained 54.3% in the that is the Japanese yen, but also at the same time at only a 47.8% growth in the Australian dollar. So what this means is that your returns are negatively or positively impacted by the changes in your FX rates as well. So what we can do as an investment manager is minimize this risk of that FX movement and how it could positively affect or negatively affect the current situation. And the way that we're able to do this is through hedging foreign currency risk. And basically it's identifying specific risks, so identifying your position in a foreign currency and taking the opposite effect. So let's say I'm buying a stock in the UK, and the UK stock goes up by 8%, but at the same time the currency, the GBP, Great British Pound, goes down by 2%. So my net return is 6% because of that change in currency. However, if I'm able to identify that risk, that negative 2% drop, I will be able to mitigate that return decrease or whatever whatever that decrease is, I can mitigate that risk and have it not be a factor of my investment portfolio returns. So basically that's the hedging foreign currency risk, is taking an inverse position in order to mitigate that movement that you do not understand or do not know. The way that we do this is financial derivatives. And has anyone seen The Big Short? It's a movie that came out just a couple months ago about the global investment crisis of 2007 to 2008. And basically what these financial derivatives do is it allows people to take inverse positions. They're all financially engineered. They're basically structures and financial components that have no underlying value themselves. So basically there's these contracts that are traded and it all has no underlying asset value. So for example, like gold has a specific price per pound of gold, but a value of this financial derivative, a future currency in the future, has no actual tangible value. So the use of these financial derivatives are able to be used without having to buy a significant exposure into this one item, yet you're still able to mitigate this risk component. And what I'm trying to decide is whether or not the reduction of risk relating to this hedging is worth it. Like, does it actually work? Like, if we take this inverse position in a specific currency, does it actually reduce the risk that investment portfolios or investment managers are exposed to? And so during my research, I basically asked three main questions. Is currency hedging effective? Which currencies should I hedge if it is? And the final question is, how often should I hedge? And I look at three different articles that address these different points. And basically, the assumptions that are made throughout help to solidify my argument that says that investment hedging and currency hedging, reducing the risk of a specific currency movement, is in fact effective. Global currency hedging, that first item that I do research in, statistically proves that the risk that is associated with a portfolio is decreased when portfolio currency hedging is used. Which currencies should I hedge? Basically, the idea of whether or not an investor should invest into emerging markets, so for example, like a very small and growing company in a very small and growing environment, should be hedged versus basically an investment in the UK. They say that you should not really hedge that risk between the UK and the US, but in fact you should hedge that risk between the US and the UK, but you shouldn't hedge that risk with the smaller components. And then how often should I hedge? Whether it's hedging the entire time, always, or is it every once in a while? And they say if you're going to do it, you should do it. So basically the main premise is, if I choose to hedge, if I choose to use these financial assets to help mitigate my risk, that I should do it as much as possible. All right, so if we look at the critical analysis, it's like, does this in fact work? And if it does work, is it worth the risks that it involves? And the graph to the right is the S&P 500 since 2005. And the reason why I asked about had anyone seen The Big Short is the reason behind the financial crisis of 2007 was mostly due to the housing market collapsing and people betting against the housing market, and that ultimately led to bankruptcies and insolvency of major banks because of these financial derivatives. They didn't understand what was going on, and ultimately the stock market crashed from about a 1,500 mark on the index and dropped all the way to like about 700 on the index. So this is a significantly dangerous and misunderstood part of the industry. This hedging is very speculative and dangerous, and it must be thoroughly understood before investing. Basically, the idea of this risk reduction has coincided with the elimination of risk. But in fact, this risk of the currencies moving and this investment portfolios decreasing has not eliminated but transferred to another party. And as an investment portfolio manager, I have experienced significant new risks, such as counterparty risks, if potentially the person that I have contracted with is not able to pay back, opportunity costs of actually having to keep money associated with these contracts, and also upside losses. For example, if we take that same investment in the UK, if it went from 8% to decrease to 6% because of the change in the currency, what if it went up to 10% or 12% or 14% because of that currency movement? If we eliminate that risk, we'll never know what the upside potential is. There's explicit hidden costs with hedging, and all the investors must really be understanding of what those implications are before beginning to understand this idea. So again, that brings us to the questions that we need to ask as investors and as managers. Do my investors want to be exposed to currency risk? Are my investors, so I'm an investment portfolio manager, and I have money that is coming from my investors who say, I want you to invest in the global markets because I believe that we're going to be able to have the most growth potential there. So then I ask that question. I say, do we want to just be exposed to specifically microeconomic factors related to the business, or do we want to also be exposed to the macroeconomic risks of changes in foreign currency? And if the answer is yes, then we have to move down to the next question, which is question number 2. If currency hedging is desired, are the benefits of reduced risk exposure worth it to the added costs? So again, those new risks that we're seeing, counterparty risks, transfer of risk, and also upside potential loss, are those all worth it to the individual investor? And that's what we have to really address as investment managers. And if the benefits do outweigh the cost, are we protected as managers from the potential downside that we saw in 2007? So a significant amount of population in 2007 and across the world saw a significant decrease in the value of their financial assets because of this derivative crisis, because of this housing crisis. And are we as investment managers protected from a downside risk such as this, or are we exposed to a significant, another traumatic experience such we saw in 2007 and 2008? And so that is some of the things that I recommend as part of my thesis and a part of my analysis, is really to make sure that as an investor, I'm understanding these assets and understanding what's going on. And I believe since the 2007-2008 market crashes that we really helped put in, the U.S. government has helped to put in a lot of really important laws and regulations about like just the ability to report on this information and help the investors really understand what's going on. The Dodd-Frank Act has really helped to increase accounting policies and increase financial policies to make sure that us as investors, we have the most protected items here. So again, I think that investment managers should really make sure that we're understanding these 3 questions, and if the investors want to be exposed to these such risks, that we really need to make sure we're understanding all the newer risks that we're addressing with these new financial derivatives and this hedging program. So, and yeah, so just again, we just really want to make sure that currency hedging and it's right for us and right for me as an investor. So, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hello, my name is Wingert, and my presentation is admittedly rather dramatic, entitled Selling Debt, Marketing and Counter-Marketing in Global Tobacco Cessation. The main aspects of global tobacco cessation that I'll be looking at involve, first let me begin with a little story. So this is Luther Terry. He was the Surgeon General of the United States around the 1960s, and specifically the pictures you're seeing here are around 1964. Now, up until this point, in the 1930s and 1940s, more and more correlational evidence has come out about the connection between smoking and negative health outcomes, especially as more time periods have gone by and longer-term studies have come forward. So here in 1964, Luther Terry releases a seminal work in public health called Smoking and Health, in which he connects smoking to all of these different studies that have come out in the previous decades and really begins a public initiative against smoking in the United States that gradually spreads throughout the world. So now, how that affects today, we'll be looking at 3 main factors, which involve 3 main actors. The first is makeup of and research on tobacco-consuming populations, people affected by consuming tobacco, and how that also interacts with economic inequality. Also looking at the efforts by tobacco companies to continue to market their products and the different tactics that they use there. And lastly, looking at governmental motives and responses to those sorts of tactics used by tobacco corporations, especially in democracies around the world. So to begin with, those affected by tobacco.
Sorry about that, folks.
Well, I'll just provide you the information as best I can without the presentation. But if we look at global tobacco consumers and we look at sort of the economic inequality globally, we see that 80% of smokers live in low to middle income countries. So 4/5 of all tobacco consumers live in lower to middle income countries. We also see that those countries account for 70% of the 4.8 million annual smoking deaths, and they also account for 74% of the 73 million disability-adjusted lost life years attributable to smoking. So we see that the economic and the health effects are largely consolidated in low to middle income countries. If we look at the USA as sort of a case study, especially since there's a large body of research, we can also see that within states, not just among states, but within states, there's also growing inequality in how tobacco consumption affects consumers. So in the US population, for example, about 18% of people at or above the poverty line smoke. But below the poverty line, we see that 29% of people smoke. So even within countries, we're seeing this inequality. If you look at education, you can see that people with only a high school education or below are 36% likely to smoke. However, people who have graduated college smoke at a rate of only 7.5%. And then also looking at other health effects, we can see by some metrics, although it's difficult to measure, that smoking is associated with a 40 to 50% likelihood of concurrent mental health or substance abuse problem. And so we can see even within countries this sort of growing disparity and disparate effect that smoking has on those populations. If we look at companies marketing tobacco, in the Minnesota tobacco settlement, in which tobacco corporations were obliged to reveal a lot of the documents that they used in terms of marketing their products. In the over 7 million documents released in that settlement, it was revealed that terms like low tar or light were designed to connote healthiness, especially to older consumers who were considering quitting, in order to encourage them to keep smoking, even though there's no health difference in the product itself. And as more and more options for marketing the products was removed, tobacco corporations in print ads used low tar and light brands in the 1970s and 80s especially, that was managed to increase revenue while by primarily keeping older consumers who are considering quitting from quitting and encouraging them to continue smoking. These sorts of marketing campaigns also encourage self-blame schemes in which it was sort of adopted by many tobacco corporations that it was an individual choice to continue to smoke. And so by encouraging that sort of rhetoric in different avenues, that psychologists have found that that contributes to self-blame in which consumers no longer begin to quit because they start to engage in a cycle of guilt that postpones quitting. If we look at one of the major tactics that tobacco companies now use is their packaging. Because their ways of marketing, especially in television or other avenues, have been limited, especially in the United States, more and more money is being spent on the packaging of cigarettes themselves. So one study found that generic packaging, removing distinctive logos, markings, etc., made them much less attractive to consumers, which makes sense intuitively. It also found that lighter colors, such as light blue or light green, connote healthiness even when nothing on the packaging says anything about being light or low carb. Those colors themselves have an effect on the consumers, and that sort of tactic is being used to help market the product. Another tactic that's been used by tobacco corporations is direct mailings, often including coupons. 70% of their mailings, in fact, include coupons. And these direct mailings target at least 13% of young adults in the United States alone. And surveys have found that non-smokers targeted by those direct mailings were more likely to have started smoking, and current smokers were less likely to have quit. In a survey of about 2,600 young adults that were part of the study. So then, what does the government, or governments around the world do to help and counter this sort of marketing used by tobacco corporations? Well, in countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, many of the tactics that they've used have been associated with plain packaging laws. Now, we've seen this in the United States as well, where warning labels begin to take up more and more of the pack of cigarettes to help reduce the marketing and different tactics they can put on it themselves. And this has seen a dramatic effect in countries like Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. But interestingly enough, we associate those sort of warning labels with harsh imagery and different sorts of messages that are put on them. But what studies have found is it's not so much the message that matters when you put it on a pack of cigarettes, but it's more the amount of space that it takes up. And so the less and less space that can be given to their advertisements, the less likely consumers are to purchase. For example, one country that's really been leading the way is Uruguay, and they instituted legislation to restrict the amount of advertising on a pack of cigarettes so that 80% of it has to include warning labels or other government-sanctioned messaging on the pack of cigarettes itself. Another tactic we see used is taxation. Of course, we've seen this, it's pretty standard supply and demand, raising the price to reduce the demand for cigarettes. And it has been shown that for every 10% increase in price, it reduces total consumption by 3 to 4%. And while this is a valuable way of reducing the consumption of cigarettes, it's also important to note that there may be more efficient ways and more tactically advantageous ways to reduce the consumption of cigarettes, such as plain packaging legislation. Especially considering the fact that taxation on cigarettes is more likely, as we've seen, to affect the lowest income brackets and lowest socioeconomic statuses within a country. So using other tactics to dissuade consumption may be more beneficial. And one case study that is really important to look at is Europe. As we've seen, they instituted laws to include 80% of the pack of cigarettes has to contain warning labels on the exterior, and they've also raised taxes, which is a fairly standard method. But in addition, Uruguay has also introduced a single presentation law. This law means that a company can only have one brand of cigarettes that they're selling within Europe. So for example, Marlboro can have a gold and white and a low tar version. Instead, they only have one presentation, a single presentation. And that way the thinking is, and the research seems to bear out, that instead of being able to suggest that one option is healthier, now they have one shot at it, and no option for consumers is going to be considered healthier option. So what are the results? What are the tangible results that Uruguay has seen based upon all of this that they've implemented? Well, in 2007, only 15% of Uruguayan women who were pregnant quit smoking by their third semester. So if they started smoking, only 15% had quit by their third semester. In 2012, after the introduction of these measures by the Uruguayan president, we saw that instead, 42% of pregnant women who were smoking quit by their third trimester. Now, obviously, we'd like 100%, but that 27% increase is really substantial. In terms of larger trends throughout the whole population, we've seen that average per person consumption of cigarettes went down by 4.3% a year in Uruguay. And then if you compare that to Argentina, for example, which was used in the study as sort of a control group for these effects, in Argentina, smoking rates actually increased by 0.6%. So again, we're seeing almost 5% difference in the overall population between Uruguay and Argentina, Uruguay having implemented these harsher tobacco restrictions. Among students, among younger populations, tobacco rates in Uruguay went down 8% a year between 2003 and 2009, and on the other hand, in Argentina, between 2001 and 2009, tobacco rate use only went down by 2.5%. So that's over a 5% difference among students in those two countries. So then I think it's also important to look at what is the governmental interest in tobacco cessation. And so we see that the government has an interest in making sure that people are healthy, and obviously voters want their public to be healthy, but you also have to take into account that the tobacco consumers don't want to be adversely affected by these regulations either, and they're going to be voting in for their government as well. So in the United States, for example, we've seen that smoking-related illnesses cost $15 to $30 billion a year in medical expenses, and smoking may also account for $49 to $70 billion that is lost to the economy due to the taking of workers out of the economy and lowering the productivity. However, some interesting and more morally dubious research has emerged suggesting that, in fact, because of the higher death rate and mortality associated with smoking, it can actually reduce the amount of old age costs associated that what the government has to pay out. And the suggested savings are about 32 cents per pack for the U.S. government. Now, obviously, that's not morally advisable to sort of allow that to happen in order to save money, but the total savings are around $4.2 billion. Based upon not having to pay out things like Medicare and Social Security. Now, obviously, that's outweighed by the moral aspect of the voters and what the voters are going to campaign for from their public officials, but it is another important aspect to take into account. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
So as you can see on the display, my topic for my presentation is ethnic race within Japan. A little bit of background on why I actually wanted to do this as a topic is because of a course I took here at Drake. The course was actually on government and politics in Japan. And then one of the themes that I noticed while I was in this course that kept coming up is the idea that Japan is a homogeneous society. The idea that there are not many cleavages within Japanese society, whether it's culture, ethnicity, history, just in general, this idea that they are a united nation. So I wanted to kind of challenge this idea with my research and dig more into the minority populations within Japan, and kind of see their relations with the ethnic Japanese, whether or not there is discrimination, just figure out what the situation is. Okay, so to start off with the term Zainichi. Zainichi is the term used to describe ethnic Koreans within Japan. And the thing about this term is it's actually has a hidden meaning behind it. The literal translation is residing in Japan. And the thing about this translation is that it does have a temporary kind of association with it. The fact that these Japanese or these Koreans are going to eventually move from Japan back to Korea. So then when you look at the Japanese population, there's roughly about 127 million people in Japan. The number is a little bit smaller than that. And then of these 127 million people, about 98.5% of them are ethnically Japanese. And to me this was kind of interesting to look at because being from somewhere like the United States, there's nothing really like this. We do have a lot of diversity here in the United States. So it was an interesting topic for me. And then of this population, the remaining 1.5% are actually minorities. The highest majority in most populous minority population is the Korean. And of the remaining 1%, the Chinese, Okinawan, Indonesian, and there are actually a substantial amount of Brazilian ethnicities within Japan. To kind of go a little bit into the relationship between Japan and Korea, there is a very long relationship. It dates back a number of years, however, for the purpose of my research, I simply limited my research to simply the end of the Meiji Restoration to modern times. So beginning with around the end of the Meiji Restoration, you see this kind of greater focus upon imperialism by Japan. You see them trying to get the exact same, not the exact same, but a similar amount of influence upon the nations around them, like the type of actions by the United States and the United Kingdom and other European powers at the time. At this time, you kind of see a decent amount of Koreans in Japan. It was a few thousand. It's not a lot, but it's still some amount of Korean ethnicity within Japan. In 1905, however, you did actually see Japan announce that Korea is a protectorate, essentially that they are protecting the nation for themselves. And then in 1910, Korea was actually annexed by Japan and occupied by Japan. Now, during this time, Koreans were not treated the best by any means. They definitely had the role of second-rate citizens. For the most part, there was discrimination. They did have menial jobs, essentially jobs that the Japanese did not want. And then, however, there was some sort of path for assimilation. There was a main focus in the Japanese Empire upon the fact that it was a multi-ethnic empire, that there were multiple areas underneath the rule of the Japanese. And at about the time of this, there are still simply a few thousand within Korea. So between the 1920s and 1930s, Japan's economy kind of began to get a little bit better. There was economic opportunity in Japan, there was educational opportunity in Japan. Those from Korea could actually move to Japan in search of a better life. Again, it was still menial labor, but it was a better life for them. For the most part, this was Korean males. You didn't see until about the middle to the late of the 1930s to actually see families from Korea move over. And when this happened, it was usually the women and children who were related to the males who were coming to Japan. And then at about this time, at the end of the 1930s, the amount of Koreans who actually were living in Japan was at about 417,000. So a vast increase from what it was in about 20, 30 years prior. And then from 1939 to 1945, you had World War II. And at this time, there actually was a vast amount of forced immigration of Koreans to Japan. And this was because of the wartime economy that Japan had. They had a desire for economic labor, and this came in the form of the Koreans because many Japanese were participating in the military. The number of ethnic Koreans at its highest point was kind of, I don't have reliable sources because the numbers vary a lot, but it was between 2 million and 2.3 million. So again, a vast difference from what it was even 10 years before. The jobs of these migrants at the time were essentially the construction and mining industries. These were the main areas that they inhabited the most. And then that moves on to the end of World War II. So at the end of World War II, the population of Zainichi within, or ethnic Koreans within Japan actually dropped from about 2 to 2.3 million down to about 600,000. It's remained at that point since. And then that began the introduction of this term called Zainichi. It was kind of a term meant to incite more nationalism within the Japanese and kind of create this idea that ethnic Koreans were a different culture than the Japanese. So from about 1945 until about the mid-50s, you kind of see a lot of discrimination against Koreans within Japan. In 1945, voting rights seizure happened, essentially taking away the voting rights of the Zainichi and other minority populations. In 1947, you have the Alien Registration Law. This required all foreigners to actually be registered in the Japanese systems. In 1950, you have the Nationality Law. So what this law was, is it essentially made it so that you were not a Japanese citizen unless your father had been Japanese. Your father was of ethnic Japanese descent. If your mother was, you were not considered to be a Japanese citizen. And then in 1952, all former colonial subjects whose nations were not considered to be a state by Japan, so this included Korea at the time, were actually rendered stateless. And this was more of, they were given a categorical code and not really, Japan didn't recognize them as having a state with which they identified. In 1955, fingerprinting actually began with foreigners, just simply to document all foreigners who were in Japan at the time. Job opportunities and education were both very limited. Again, Japanese Koreans were actually limited to menial work. This included legal activities, scrap collecting and selling was one that was very prevalent, and for the most part were just limited to these areas of society that were not considered to be sought after. And then, for the most part, there were education limitations. At the time, a lot of the education was actually taught by civil societies who were created by the Koreans. And that kind of leads on to this next point, divisions within Zainichi society. So it wasn't simply divisions within or between Japanese and Koreans that affected the Zainichi, but also divisions within their own society. So there were two main identifiers to identify Zainichi within Japan, and those were Zainichi Chosenjin and Zainichi Kankokujin. The first of these pertains to those who identified with either a unified Korean state or later on following the Korean War, those who identified with North Korea. And then the other one is meant to identify with those who associated with South Korea. So there were two main organizations within Japan, and those were Chongryeon or Soren and Mindam. Now Soren was was an association that was related heavily with North Korea, and this organization provided educational opportunities, the actual teaching of Korean language and Korean culture. It provided loans, and it also was just meant to create a sort of society where Koreans could actually feel as if they were welcome. Mindam, a South Korean organization, attempted to replicate this. However, it did not see very much success in the early days. There were a lot of preferences toward Chongryeon or Soren, the North Korean organization, simply because of the early success that North Korea saw, and the lack of success that South Korea saw with its early authoritarian leadership and just simple economic. It was very slow to actually reach an economic state that could sustain itself. So the current preference has actually shifted, and that is actually because of relations between Japan and South Korea and Japan and North Korea. So there were actually improvements for Zainichi within Japan. These happened between the 70s and the 90s. There were a few social movements 70s, these were the anti-fingerprinting, which was meant to stop this fingerprinting practice, this kind of marginalizing action. And then there's also a real name movement. Now, what this was meant to do was to stop the adoption of Japanese names when a Korean or an ethnic Korean would attempt to naturalize as a Japanese citizen. Under this law, beforehand, they were actually required to take on a Japanese name in order to become a full Japanese citizen. And there was also a movement for local suffrage. In the 80s, education and employment gaps significantly narrowed. There was less discrimination within employments as well as education. As well as you saw medical and scientific fields being occupied by a higher proportion of Zainichi than Japanese. In 1985, there were nationality laws revisions, and this actually took away the patrilineal law that required a person's father to be of ethnic Japanese descent in order for them to be considered a Japanese citizen. In 1987, the practice of taking ethnic names, or ethnically Japanese names when naturalizing was also stopped. In the 1990s, actually, Zainichi were given a permanent residency status. Now, this wasn't full citizenship, but it was meant to kind of demonstrate the idea that they did have a permanent place within Japanese society. In 1993, the practice of fingerprinting actually was fully halted. So currently, there are some stresses, but they have seen some improvements. So currently, a lack of relations with North Korea has actually kind of hurt the public opinion of Koreans within Japan. And also, there was a case of kidnappings a few years ago by North Korea of Japanese citizens. So this has even further damaged the relationship between the two. There's also a huge rise in nationalism lately of the far right. You see a lot more demonstrations against Zainichi saying that they have preferential status and that they can't actually take on Japanese names and that this is wrong. So there is also this idea of a homogeneous Japanese identity. Now this is promoted not only by the public but also by the government, this idea of those being in Japan are Japanese and that there are not really minorities, that it's a more homogeneous nation. Now there have been improvements. There is an increased interest in Korean culture, whether that be sports or entertainment. A lot of this had to do with the recent World Cups that happened in the area. And then there is external pressure against discrimination. Now, this is coming from things like the United Nations, other international organizations or states who are highly democratic and go against this type of discrimination. There's also that increasing rise in naturalization of Zainichi citizens, so actually taking on that Japanese citizenship. And that is it.
I have a couple questions for Jeff. One, how, if any, do people try and exploit arbitrage rules? And second, with the different European American options, how is that established? What's used in like foreign exchange markets? I had one other question. Yeah, how do regulatory policies work between the different countries? Which countries is used?
Sure. First, address the arbitrage. Basically, there are traders out in the world that are constantly monitoring the FX rates and the different interest rates in each of the individual countries, and that's basically what each investor is trying to take advantage of. Is they constantly look for these small differences where they can pump money through the system by buying one currency and then investing it at a certain interest rate and then buying it back at the different FX rate to continually make money. They're not investing in anything significant. All they're doing is finding little differences in the markets and exploiting those opportunities. It happens all the time. However, you have to be constantly monitoring and you have to know that's your strategy. And as an investment manager for people people's retirement savings or people's pensions, like that's probably not the #1 goal. So there are some traders that are on, sitting on Wall Street or Denver, Colorado is actually a pretty common place for a lot of international investing with currencies. So they really try and take advantage of those opportunities. A lot of times, so to go to your next point about the options, a lot of times I didn't do any research on like what is more common, whether it's a European or American option. Basically the difference, so the different types of financial derivatives that can be used are futures, forwards, options, swaps, and a bunch of other fun stuff that we can go into a long lecture about. But basically, they're used interchangeably. I would say the most that are used are forwards and futures because they are specific currency amounts for a long period of time in the future that are more regulated. So the futures market can be traded on a regular basis as opposed to the options, which are more over the counter, which can be a little bit more of an issue. And then in regards to regulation, so the Dodd-Frank Act was anything that really applies to the US. And basically what the Dodd-Frank did was after the financial crisis of 2007, try to really get some transparency with this derivatives market and make sure that it is really well known to the public of what's exactly happening and whether that's in the US or across the world. So one of the ways they do that is they make sure that each of these investors are keeping up a certain amount of money in their accounts with changes of their current balance. So one of the ways is they continue to make these margin calls is what they're called. Basically it's like, well, your account currently is short, so we're making you put up more money to make sure your position is covered. So that way we can reduce the risks of the 2007-2008 crisis. So even though it was a terrible crisis, it has allowed us to really leverage that issue and create a better system for us to not avoid that in the future.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question? Thank you.
I had a question for John. I don't pretend to know everything about this, but I've heard allegations that the United States, while having a health outlook on smoking here, in other countries abroad, their policy has been shown to be the opposite. I was just wondering if your research, if you found anything of this.
Well, there's one particularly interesting example where the Czech Republic was considering instituting harsher restrictions on smoking, including plain packaging legislation and other things. And lobbyists from Philip Morris, that owns Marlboro, approached the Czech Republic with this research and essentially said, you don't want to reduce smoking. If you do, it'll increase all of these other costs and we'll have other problems later on. And made a very explicit argument to them that it was not in their financial interest to help the health of their citizens. Of course, Philip Morris suffered backlash for that, and the Czech Republic did end up going on along with their proposed regulations. But your point is well taken that the health is not always the driving factor because at some points, especially, for example, I use the example of Uruguay, which has tried very ardently to institute harsh regulations and have seen a suit from Philip Morris in terms of the restrictions that are being put on their copywritten logos and other marketing materials by the plain packaging legislation. So if the country wants to avoid those sorts of consequences or wants to make their lives financially easier, it may be an option.
All right, folks, I'm back again. I just wanted to ask, let's see, which one seems to go? All right, yeah. Morgan, I just wanted to ask, what do you think, what has it been like the U.S.'s experience in general with the International Court of Justice? Has it been like pretty positive? Is the U.S. pleased with the decisions it's handing out, or is it not so happy about it? Because, I mean, we're not even a member of the International Criminal Court, so I don't know what their thoughts on the ICJ.
Right, so it's actually really interesting. It's pretty conspicuous, the most recent developments in the relationship between the ICJ and the U.S. A case I referenced was the case between Nicaragua. It was Nicaragua v. United States. And that was an ICJ decision where the ICJ said that the United States has basically taken an act of war by helping to arm the Contras, or not the Contras, the guerrilla army in Nicaragua. And also there was a manual that had advocated for human rights violations that was actually distributed by the United States government to the rebel forces in Nicaragua. And so the ICJ determined that they would be forced to pay reparations to individuals who had been harmed, or they had to pay reparations. And so the U.S. Probably would have just refused to pay the reparations, but they actually didn't get to that point because they just completely got upset when the court determined that they had jurisdiction. So the first part of most ICJ decisions is whether or not the court has jurisdiction, because the laws can be really fuzzy. And so the United States was upset as soon as the ICJ determined that it had jurisdiction. And so at that point, the United States actually withdrew compulsory jurisdiction. It's one of the only countries, I believe it's the only country, I might be wrong, there might be a couple of others. If there are, then there are not very many, that have actually at one point submitted acceptance of compulsory jurisdiction and then withdrawn it. So I would say definitively negative is the relationship between the ICJ and the United States. And something I touched on a little bit that exacerbates this is the fact that the Security Council traditionally is the enforcement wing of the ICJ, but one of the 5 veto-holding members of the Security Council is the United States. So that really makes the entire system very complex.
Yeah, I think the U.S. has a problem with some international bodies in general, just because like we're the #1 power, so we can basically do whatever we want to, but the other folks are saying, no, you shouldn't do that, and we can get upset, like the Iraq War, etc. So, thank you. And then Cody, I was just curious, are like any Zainichi, like have they made any progress in like, I know you talk about like the Chosjin and like, I'm not sure I pronounce the other one, but like have any like Zainichi been able to get elected office or anything like that?
I actually did not read anything about Zainichi being elected to office, though there were a few cases where some would actually be more open about their natural heritage. So one of the main things within Japan is that if you are ethnically Korean, most people don't talk about it because it's not something you want people to know, because the overwhelming majority are ethnically Japanese and there is discrimination still. So I know there isn't full, I don't think there's anyone who's actually made it to office that I know of, but there are people who are starting to more so vocalize the fact that they are of Korean descent, and they actually are, there are some who are mainstream icons or cultural.
Yeah, I think you see the same thing with Iraq women as well in Japan, but
well, I'm just going to go back. So I wanted to ask you Jeff a question. So at the level of an individual transaction, hedging just shifts risk from one actor to another.
Yeah.
What I'm more interested in, though, is systemic risk. So as individual actors try to, actually it's not just about reducing your risk exposure, because there's someone at the other end who is accepting your risk exposure in hopes of higher return. So it always has both ways, right? But at that level, individuals, therefore, are engaging in these fairly complex strategies to either reduce or to accept more risk. And as that increases the volume of transactions, the complexity of the system, perhaps reducing the transparency in the system about actually where does risk lie at any given point? How much risk has any given actor, especially large actors, accumulated? Is there a possibility that hedging, therefore, and perhaps derivatives in general, actually increase the systemic risk from an individual standpoint? It looks like a way of reducing risk, but could it increase the systemic risk?
Absolutely, and I think one of the lovely things that I am, for the ability for my fellow finance students and business students and students in general overall, to be able to experience and study on a regular basis is the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So in that crisis, the housing market went down. People were unable to pay off their mortgages. They had a default on their loans, and that ended up causing lots of individuals to go bankrupt and dip below poverty levels. And so that was a serious concern. Yet that was also multiplied by the amount of exposure that was out there because of these derivative instruments. So these large banks were so exposed to this huge risk that they had no idea how bad it could have gotten. So yes, the recession in 2007 was bad, but what was worse is when these banks, the Lehman Brothers, and these other large institutions that were supposed to be these rock-steady investment and banks that were always going to be there, got destroyed and got wiped out in a single day because of these financial derivatives. So yeah, it basically took a small decrease in the housing market and then turned it into a global financial crisis because of derivatives. So you have to understand the kind of the difficulties and the additional risks that go along with it.
Great, thank you so much. Well, let's give the panel a round of applause. So I wanted to mention a couple things. First of all, we are taping this event today, and